Hello, my name is Ashish Bhimani. I'm one of the electrophysiologists at the Piedmont Heart Institute in Atlanta, and I'm joined here today by one of my partners, Dr. Sandeep Goyal. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hello, I'm Sandeep Goyal. I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist and medical director of the electrophysiology labs at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital. And me and Dr. Bhimani would be discussing about left atrial appendage closure.
Well, thank you for joining me, Sandeep. I thought we could start off by talking a little bit about, the patients that we send for left atrial appendage closure. I think, everyone's pretty well aware that when Watchman first came onto the scene, there were a couple of big studies, PROTECT and PREVAIL, and, the outcomes weren't quite as, clear as one way or the other. I think some people took it as optimistic that there was some efficacy, but others, felt that it didn't really meet the technical non-inferiority that they started with. And so I think initially a lot of us felt like, well, this is certainly a good option, particularly for patients who can't be on a blood thinner, maybe not quite as good as a blood thinner, but better than nothing. And so that's really where we started with, which patients should we send to get evaluated for this. But tell me, what is your approach in thinking about who's a good candidate for left atrial appendage closure?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that when the initial two big studies, PROTECT AF and PREVAIL, gave us a lot of good data, but they left a little bit of cloud of uncertainty in terms of proving a definite non-inferiority over warfarin. However, given that those studies included patients who were able to take oral anticoagulation and showed that there is a good amount of stroke risk reduction in patients with left atrial appendage closure, and some of the difficulties were related to sort of early procedural complications. It definitely gave us a lot of confidence early on that this would be a good alternative to consider for patients who are not good candidates for long-term oral anticoagulation. And both FDA and CMS had similar thoughts, and that's why it was approved in US for that patient population. And we really looked for very good reasons that the patients are not able to tolerate long-term oral anticoagulation. However, I think that has changed quite a bit over a period of time in terms of improved safety profile of the devices and the implant. I think we are not at a point where we would consider this to be a primary therapy replacing oral anticoagulation, but certainly, I consider it a lot more in my practice for patients who are having, any significant problems tolerating oral anticoagulation, where I expect them to have, either recurrent bleeding or, recurrent falls, things that are not going to be one time, where there is a chance that those problems will continue to recur, that will prevent them from being on long-term oral anticoagulation, are, established good candidates for this therapy.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. The studies initially were comparing warfarin against the first generation initial device. And, obviously neither one of those is being used primarily in, stroke risk reduction for our AFib patients. And so obviously we're going to need more, clinical trial data to really highlight, who the best patients are. But, you made one of the things that I've seen is that as the technology has improved, we've got newer devices, we've got second generation devices. Can you tell us a little bit about why those improve safety, or how they improve the safety, and how you incorporate that into our decision making?
So I think even in my own practice, the sort of cadence of left atrial appendage closure had significantly increased since the second generation Watchman, also known as Watchman Flex, came out. And there were, I think, several design improvements from the first generation Watchman device to the Watchman Flex device. But I think a couple of the most important things from a safety standpoint were that the Watchman Flex device is closed from from the front end. So the original Watchman device was open, so you really had these sharp pieces that you led with inside the appendage, and you had to place your delivery sheath deep inside the appendage, which was part of the reason I think there was higher risk for pericardial effusion. In the Watchman Flex device, it's basically a closed device at the front, and you could lead with a soft, what they call a ball, and implant the device very safely. And it's really essentially eliminated a direct device-related pericardial effusion. The risk is not zero, but it's pretty close to zero. And the second big change they made was really making the device shorter. So it was able to be accommodated by sort of a lot more left atrial appendage anatomies than the initial device was. And the third, I think, big thing would be the Watchman device has a screw at the back. That's how it's attached to its delivery system. And they were able to cover a lot of that screw with the fabric. And the reason that is important is because that is a potential site for thrombus formation. And if you are able to, reduce the surface area of a metallic component, then I think it certainly helps. So I think that was a big advance that really made the procedure significantly safer. And it was proven in the Pinnacle Flex trial, which was a non-randomized trial, but it was over 400 patients, and the overall major complication rate was less than 0.5%. And the success rate for the device was over 98%, which speaks in terms of the development of the technology in itself. And in the recent sort of last year, we now have had the Amulet device available, which is an alternative that has been available in Europe for several years, but we haven't had access to. And that has really added sort of another layer of precision, because now you are able to sort of pick and choose devices based on the individual patient characteristics and individual anatomies. And the Amulet device was compared to the first generation Watchman device because when the trial started, that was the available device that we had. So it's shown a very comparable efficacy and safety to the original device, but we don't have head-to-head data between Amulet and the Watchman Flex device.
I know initially, because of the points you made about the initial Watchman and which type of anatomy it would fit well, there was a thought about what kind of pre-procedural imaging or how do we assess the left atrial appendage before we move forward. These newer devices sound like they give us a little more flexibility to cover most appendages. Tell me about pre-procedural imaging. Is that something you still think is warranted for most patients, or do you think that we're at the point where we can close almost all appendages, that we can just go straight forward with the procedure?
I think we have significantly improved our ability to perform left atrial appendage closure in majority of patients. We only have rare patients that would not be able to be closed with a percutaneous device now. So I think that when only Watchman first generation was available, I used pre-procedure imaging to decide which patients I would bring to the lab for closure and which I would not. Now, I think I still personally try to get as much as possible pre-procedural imaging and really try to get CT imaging, because that provides you a three-dimensional view of the appendage. And the reason for that is not as much whether we are going to be able to close this particular anatomy. It's true that occasionally it does tell us that, there's going to be no suitable device, but more importantly, it allows us to assess the characteristics of the left atrial appendage and makes the implant itself a lot easier. So, you are able to obtain accurate sizing. So you know what size device you're going to use. And, you're really, there are programs that are available where you can do a virtual implant of either the Watchman or the Amulet device, and can get a lot of sort of information that allows you to have a much better idea of how the device is going to interact with the left atrial appendage, and make the procedure much more efficient and safer. So I think that's really the predominant use of the pre-procedural imaging today, compared to, when we started, it was more to sort of decide a yes or no.
Well, let's keep on that theme of the imaging and go into the procedure room itself. So I know initially, one of the challenges was just from an operational standpoint, having the implanter for the Watchman. Then also we typically would have a second physician helping with the TEE to help guide the placement. But I understand that ICE is being used a little more. Can you talk a little bit about using ICE versus TEE and some trade-offs that we might face with that?
That has been a big change, at least in my practice, and I think nationally, that intracardiac echo is being used more and more often for all kind of structural heart and electrophysiological interventions, and left atrial appendage is no different. My personal practice is probably 90+% is now with intracardiac echocardiography, where 2 years ago it was probably 5% with intracardiac echocardiography. TE has a lot of unique advantages. The biggest of those is that all the trials have been done with TEs. All the criteria we use are developed off the transesophageal echocardiography. And, it's something that we have had long experience. It's relatively cheap and easily available in most labs, and could really provide very high 3D imaging, which, so it's a very well proven commodity. However, one of the big challenges is that a lot of the left atrial appendage closure patients, especially in the recent past, are older patients who are relatively frailer. And if we could avoid general anesthesia, which is essentially comes every time you use DE for a procedural intervention, then that is really a big help. And that's where sort of the initial ICE use sort of started, because we are able to do this under moderate sedation. And, it really reduces the recovery time for patients, and overall patient experience is significantly better. And then, I think there are a number of patients who have contraindications to the TE because of the, esophageal varices or strictures or things like that. And those patients, the ICE was also gaining sort of more utility for. And then we have patients who, are at risk, more risks related to TE. And that's mostly related to, fully anticoagulated patients tend to have a little more sort of bleeding events. And anytime you intervene in a different part of the body, I think, oral injury, esophageal injury are other risks that definitely remain present. And one thing I have learned and realized in doing sort of a lot of the transeptal punctures, both under intracardiac echo and under TE guidance, that the inferior part of the septum is much better visualized in intracardiac echo, and that is usually our target area for these procedures. So it actually provides better imaging. And then as you alluded to at the start, that the workflow is a huge issue. Normally you need 3 physicians, an anesthesiologist, an implanter, and an echocardiographer. And this reduces it to 2. So that allows better scheduling. And so all of the reasons have allowed sort of ICE imaging to gain prominence. I think, in terms of the data, we have a significant amount of data, even going as far back as 2007 with small series. And a lot of the data has been sort of single, dual center, small series data, but it has shown that, it's a very comparable safety and efficacy to TE. And there are two sort of prospective studies that are looking at it. One is the ICE LAA, and another one is the ICE Watchman, that would also provide us sort of more robust data on the safety and efficacy of the intracardiac echo-guided approach. I think that is really the future of imaging for left atrial appendage closure. And the 3D ICE, they call it 4D ICE, is also coming onto the scene, which is really going to help improve the imaging, provide biplanar imaging, and make it easier for one physician to operate both the ICE and the device itself. I think the thing that we would have to see about that is really going to come down to reimbursement and whether the cost of the 4D ICE would be affordable for a routine use. But I personally feel that if the technology is proven, then the cost constraints get figured out. Eventually, the price of the device will go down and reimbursement will keep up with it if the technology is right for the patient. So I think, I'm a big proponent of using intracardiac echo for both patients and operational reasons.
Obviously, most electrophysiologists and interventional cardiologists are, familiar with using intracardiac echocardiography. Was the learning curve to switch from TE to ICE for the procedures a long one, or you think that most people can pick that up pretty quickly?
So I think if you use intracardiac echo, for other things, then it does make it a little bit easier. I think as electrophysiologists, a lot of us will do obviously the right atrial and right ventricular based imaging from the intracardiac echo, but some of us routinely also examine the left atrium and the pulmonary veins and the left atrial appendage, even from the left atrium with the ICE as just part of the, better understanding the anatomy for AF ablations. And I think that really helped me quite a bit when I started doing them with intracardiac echocardiography. And I initially used for, several cases, even, 3D mapping to really best understand what are the views that we are going to get. I think for most electrophysiologists, it will probably not take more than 8 to 10 implants to become proficient. And, you could even do implants where you could have both TE and ICE together. I think on the interventional side, it more depends on how much experience they have. And I think people who have experience would probably take the similar number of cases. And if you don't have a lot of ICE experience, then it may take 20, 25 cases to get really proficient at ICE imaging. I think the other thing that, sometimes we are comparing TE and ICE as like the same technologies, other than being intracardiac or other than both being echocardiography, there are different technologies and you're never going to get the same views. And so you have to really learn that the views from the ICE are going to be slightly different from the TE, and that takes a little bit of sort of getting used to.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously with the new devices, the change in how we can use imaging, I think the procedure is becoming safer, becoming a little more, operationally efficient, maybe lower risk on some of the avenues of how we do the procedure. Let's get back to the clinical arena a little bit. One of the biggest challenges is we have a device that's great for patients who can't be on anticoagulation. Yet when they get the device, we request that they be on anticoagulation for, typically at least that 6-week period while we're waiting for to verify that there's no leak. Are there new data starting to show that maybe we can use different, paradigms for anticoagulation or antiplatelet therapies to minimize risk in that short post-op period?
No, I think that's a very critical point because, that's sort of something we all struggle with, that how do we get these patients sort of safely through that period where anticoagulation or is currently indicated. And it's also very timely because I think the amulet device was studied with dual antiplatelet therapy. And so we really don't need any period of oral anticoagulation after the amulet device. It's actually discouraged to use oral anticoagulation because there was a higher rate of pericardial effusions if you did get oral anticoagulation post the amulet device implant, especially in the earlier period. And the device-related thrombus risk was actually lower than the Watchman device. So even with dual antiplatelet therapy, a lot of us have been using dual antiplatelet therapy even with the Watchman device before amulet was available, and for patients who we did not think could tolerate oral anticoagulation or had very early bleeding on oral anticoagulation. And I think based on that data, FDA actually, I think only a couple of weeks ago, have approved the Watchman Flex device to be used with dual antiplatelet therapy. Now, this is not based on the randomized trial data, but it's certainly, a much larger number of patients from NCDR registry that are available, and the outcomes have been quite good. And I think we tend to use too much oral anticoagulation and antiplatelets in these patients because that's what was used in the clinical trials. But NCDR registry also clearly showed that if you had patients on both aspirin and an oral anticoagulation in those first 6 weeks, they had a pretty high risk of bleeding. But if you took away the aspirin and just did oral anticoagulation, the bleeding risk dropped substantially without any change in stroke or device-related thrombus risk. So I think the real-world data is really telling us that we need to a little bit pull back on the amount of anticoagulation and antiplatelets we are using in the early post-op period.
Yeah, especially for the ones who are, the highest risk of bleeding, which, tend to be the ones who have the most to gain from having this procedure done. Well, I think that, clearly the whole thing from pre to intra-op to post-op, some of the new changes that are evolving are going to, potentially make this procedure, maybe more accessible or more appropriate for a wider variety of patients. But that's where the clinical data and the clinical trials are going to help guide us. In terms of the device space, are there things that you think coming down the pipeline, or things that industry can help us with to try to evolve the devices for the next generation and what we might be looking for?
The technology has evolved quite a bit, but there are some Achilles heel that we are still dealing with, and one of the ones is that there are a number of patients who still have leaks post implant, and if you have a large enough leak, then potentially the benefit of the device goes down. And again, one of the NCDR registry studies have again shown that the leaks are not good after the device implant. So really working on the device, both the device design and procedural techniques to really reduce the risk of leaks is really critical. And I think there has been much improved understanding, especially based on the post-operative CT imaging, as to which anatomies are more prone to leak and which are less prone to leak, and how to avoid those leaks, and really, getting much better pre-procedural planning using sort of, artificial intelligence based platforms to, guide what size and which device to use would be really, really helpful. I think the second most, feared problem is device-related thrombus, and that's why we use oral anticoagulation early on. But I think that risk, it's significantly reduced after the early period, but it's not eliminated. And there are reports of, late device-related thrombus also. And there has been sort of a lot of work being done in the device design space as to how to reduce that. There is a device conformal, which is in clinical trials, and and they are using a sort of a thread tether rather than a actual metallic tether, and the foam is covering the screw much more. And the idea behind that is that this will help eliminate or reduce the risk of DRT even further. Obviously that is a unproven claim at this point, and we will see if clinical trial data support that. And so I think that is something that's going to be critically important for us to work on those two things. And the third one would really be if we find a device face that would really eliminate the need for anything more than a single antiplatelet agent, then that would really allow our highest risk patients who probably benefit most from the device be able to safely have this implant done. And I think that if we can sort of solve those three problems, that could be sort of close to holy grail. And so I think that's sort of my wish list for what should be happening in next 5 to 10 years.
Well, thank you. We all know that reducing stroke risk for our atrial fibrillation patients is definitely one of the biggest challenges we face, and it's exciting to see the space evolve, and hopefully we'll see continued evolution, which ultimately leads to improved patient safety and outcomes. So, Dr. Goyle, thank you so much for joining me and being part of this, and thank you, Medscape, for the opportunity to have this conversation with everybody.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion.